Hi, my name is Jeff. Welcome to my channel, Jeff's Cave of Cool Books. And today I'd like to talk about and introduce a very fun, old school pulp science fiction series of stories, the Professor Jameson stories by the writer Neil R. Jones. And I'm going to talk about some Ace book versions of these, but they were originally published in the pulps, the ones that were published by Neil R. Jones. Now, Neil R. Jones, not to be confused with another science fiction writer, Raymond F. Jones, was born in 1909 and passed away in 1988. His main job was as a New York State unemployment insurance claims investigator, and he retired from that job in 1973. And I guess he rather moonlighted as a science fiction pulp writer. He published several stories in the pulps, but his by far his most successful series, and the one that if he's remembered at all, the one that he's remembered for these days, are his Professor Jameson stories. Now, he wrote 30 Professor Jameson stories in his life. Not all of them were published. Roughly 2/3 or so, 20 or so, were published in his lifetime. And the very first one was published in Amazing Stories in July 1931. Now, he didn't receive a cover illustration for his first story, of course, because it took a while for this series to be known and for him to be known. But quickly, the Professor Jameson stories became very popular in Amazing, and later stories that he wrote warranted cover illustrations. Now, Jones published the first 12 Professor Jameson stories in Amazing Science Fiction, the pulp, between the years 1931 and 1938. After that, he moved to Astonishing Stories from 1940 to 1942 and had another 4 Professor Jameson stories published there. And then the last 4 that were published in his lifetime were in the pulp Super Science Stories from 1949 to 1951. Now, again, he continued to write these stories, but several of them were never published. And a couple of them did show up later in these Ace paperback editions, which 5 collections were published in 1967 and 1968 by Ace Books. Here's the first one, The Planet of the Double Sun, one of these lovely little thin Ace paperback collections, little smaller size. And again, lots of small print inside. So quite a lot packed in there. There were 3 stories, the very first 3 stories in the Professor Jameson series, which were the Jameson Satellite and The Planet of the Double Sun, the titular story from the name of this collection. And finally, the last story in the collection, The Return of the Tripeds. So this was a nice short book, came out in 1967. There was one more published in the slightly smaller editions of these. This is The Sunless World, and there were another 3 stories published in this. And again, you'll see a very nice cover illustration here with the Zeromes investigating the Sunless World. Then there was the third one. The next 3 that were published, number 3, number 4, number 5, and the Professor Jameson Space Adventure series, reverted to regular mass market paperback size. This is Space War, which contained another 3 stories. And these stories were Zora of the Zeromes, yes, a female Zerome, Space War, and Labyrinth. The 4th edition was titled Twin Worlds, and also a mass market paperback edition. And this one was published in also 1967. This included the title story Twin Worlds, On the Planet Fragment, and the Music Monsters. And finally, there was the last paperback edition the title Doomsday on Adyat, which in this case had 4 stories in it. In the Meteoric Cloud, The Accelerated World, The Metal Moon, and Doomsday on Adyat. And all of these, or most of these stories, are in the 45, 50 to 60 page length, so novella length. There are a few that are a little shorter, but mostly they're that length. After that, there were no more published. Now, what were who was Professor Jameson, and what were the stories about? Well, Professor Jameson was an earth scientist in the 1950s. Now, keep in mind this first story was written 20 years previously. Professor Jameson is getting older. He knows his body is failing, and he has a kind of obsession with immortality. He's studying various ways that earth peoples, such as the Egyptians, had tried to attain immortality by mummification of a sort. He didn't like the idea of his body moldering away in the earth, being eaten by the worms and breaking down. So he wanted to come up with some way to preserve his corporeal existence, or to preserve his body. He wanted to come up with some way to preserve his body without it deteriorating. So he came up eventually, after trying several of the methods, he came up with the idea of making a space coffin, a rocket ship where he could place his body inside after death, in a sort of early idea about cryo sleep, and kept frozen in the depths of space as it orbited around the Earth. And he proceeds to do this. So after he passes away, his nephew follows his instructions, places him in the rocket that the professor, before he died, constructed, and shoots him off into space. And he rotates around the Earth. Flash forward 40 million years later, and a race of interstellar explorers called the Zeromes arrives in their spaceship. They hover above the now desolated and dead world of planet Earth, and they find the professor's spaceship, space coffin, and take a look inside. And their medical officer determines that the professor's brain is salvageable. So they move his brain into one of their machine men bodies. Now, the Zeromes were a race who also came up with a way to achieve immortality by So the Zeromes were a race of aliens who also were organic creatures, but came up with their own method of immortality, which was to replace their brains into these machine men bodies. Now, what do the machine men look like? Again, you have some depictions of them inside the books, and of course on covers of the Pulps. These are probably illustrations from the Pulps, right? You can get an idea. They're basically a cubicle-shaped metal body, or some kind of metal material that is virtually indestructible. And here's a nice picture of a weird alien creature chasing one of them, with 4 legs and 6 tentacled appendages with little digits where they can manipulate instruments and other things. A conical head with several large video receptors, or basically big eyes, where they can see on a 360-degree view, and that protects the organic brain. They communicate via telepathy, and the professor finds himself awakening, and quite at first, of course, shocked and horrified to find himself in this body, where he tries to raise his arm, and here comes a tentacle in front of himself. And he looks down and sees his metal shell, and kind of freaks out a little bit at first, as you would. But gradually, he becomes used to it, and with the assistance of the Zeromes, he heads back down to the planet Earth and checks it out in a rather, I wouldn't say melancholy, but reflective piece of that first story, the Jameson Satellite, where he reflects on, you know, Earth's history and how all the civilizations, all the people he knew, and all the great brains and artistic minds in the past of humanity are gone, vanished. The Earth is dead completely. And he is the last remaining being that remembers that society. But he quickly looks to the future as the Zeromes invite him to join their crew as they traverse the galaxy, exploring new worlds, new civilizations, new planets, and he readily agrees to join them and goes on in the subsequent adventures to do just that. Now, he's not called by his name, Professor Jameson. The Zeromes, who again are not just from Zerome, from the planet Zor, there are, like Professor Jameson, a few other alien creatures who were deemed fitting to move their brains into metal machine man bodies and join the crew. And as the series goes on, they occasionally add new members this way from other races. But the professor is given a name, a number name. All the Zeromes all the machine men go by numerical designations, usually with numerical and alphabetical. And the professor's new name is 21MM392. Now, thankfully for us readers, the author, Neil R. Jones, continues to refer to Professor Jameson as the professor or as Jameson most of the time in the narration of the stories. But when he is addressed by other machine men, he is called 21MM392. Now, in recent years, there were some newer editions, paperback editions of these Professor Jameson stories put out by Armchair Fiction. There were 4 volumes. They were called the Professor Jameson Saga, books 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I believe they contain most of the same stories as were found in these Ace paperback editions. And some of them are still readily available. Now, I'm not going to make any claim that these stories are masterpieces of literature or full of beautifully written prose. They're not. But fans of pulp science fiction and early pulp science fiction will know what they're getting into. Neil R. Jones is a solid writer, though. As John Clute says in his Encyclopedia of Science Fiction about Neil R. Jones, he's a vigorous, straightforward writer, and I think that's fair. He does have some poetic flights of fancy and some purple prose here and there. The dialogue, is generally being uttered, albeit telepathically, by robots. So we're not talking, it's pretty stiff and declamatory sort of dialogue, but it gets the job done. And the main thing is there is a lot of interesting and enjoyable stuff in these. And what Neil R. Jones can provide and does provide is a strong sense of wonder, that old school pulp sci-fi, anything goes, crazy ideas sort of writing. And on that level, he could be highly enjoyable. So if you like that kind of thing, or you think you might like that kind of thing, I recommend checking them out if you can track them down. That's the Professor Jameson series by Neil R. Jones, and I think they're a lot of fun. Okay, thanks for checking this out, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.